Hey, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of a new series that we're doing under Navigating Carbon called Common Ground. I'm really excited to be kicking this off because there's a lot going on in the markets. And for those of you that don't know me that well, my name's Deb Ryan, and I'm actually a petroleum engineer by background. And I cut my teeth and started off my career running around on offshore oil rigs, doing drilling and production and things like that. And I've come a long way from those days in Australia running around offshore on an oil rig, and really thrilled to introduce my co-host. So Teresa.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hartman. I'm an environmental manager by training. Nowadays, I mostly work on policy, but I've come a long way because I used to organize protests outside of lignite mining sites.
So we've got back in the day, we would have hated each other. We would have been screaming at each other,
Each other.
and, and yet here we are. And we've been talking about this for a little while of like, how do we find common language? How do we think about emission reduction and carbon markets and carbon policy and environmental policy, regulation, and even regulation for things like oil and gas and mining and all these other industries that we've got all over the world? And so we've been kicking around this idea, and we really want to tackle, things that are going on in the news and stuff. But today we're really going to sort of do a bit of a dive in so everyone can get to know us. So let's kind of start with like one of the things that I've been talking about a lot, and I know you and I have been going back around this, is this idea of this non-overlapping Venn diagram. Anyone that knows me has heard this spiel before, but I feel like we've got a number of different groups, and they're not talking, and it's almost getting worse to a certain extent.
There's way more,
Where we've
especially in the US.
Yeah. Where we've got industry broadly in one bucket. We've got a lot of the tech, and whether that's clean tech in terms of data and stuff like that, or if it's actual physical technology in another bucket. And then we've got the sort of the carbon markets and the environmental groups and the nonprofit groups, probably throw some regulators in there as well. And everyone's just pointing fingers and yelling at each other and doesn't want to talk to each other. And it's not going to move the needle. It's not going to get us anywhere. And so, like, Teresa, I'd love your kind of take on that. You've very much come from some of that environmental nonprofit side, and I very much come from industry. So I'd love to hear kind of your kind of take around what you've seen in this space around challenges, how we even have conversations.
How do we even have conversations? No, totally. And I mean, I think that there's so much of the finger pointing going on, right? As in, like, we're blaming big industry, or big industry says that environmentalists aren't being reasonable, or that the legislation isn't there. And then, government turns back around and says that there isn't enough support in civil society. And I think, like, in this circle, like, we just never get anywhere, right? Because there's always, like, somebody else that we can outsource responsibility to. So yeah, something that, like, I loved your non-overlapping Venn diagram, right? Like the kind of like three circles that like just never overlap, which is very much where I think we are, and I think that those divides are deepening, right? And like the more we see sort of inequality on the rise and people struggling to make ends meet, and there's this whole like move to the right, right? So like politically, we're seeing a move to the right both in Europe and then the US. And I think the more we have these like separations in society, the harder it gets for us to just sit down and say, we may not agree on everything, but we should be at the same table and talk about it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I've been really struggling with lately, and again, as I think about like to bring that Venn diagram together, we need a common issue. We need a common goal that we can all then work back from to find some solutions. And I thought that the goal would be about emission reduction, but more and more, I don't think that that's the right answer, particularly because of what we're seeing with some of the deregulation here in the US and some of that kind of stuff. And even the deal with the EU to take all of the US's LNG and energy and stuff that we saw this week and stuff like that. And so I'm even struggling to figure out what is that central issue that gets everyone to the table. And I think the thing that you touched on there is around this idea of, energy poverty and, how do we actually like help people out and do what we need to do, but like without hurting anybody, both from an energy access point of view, but also from an environmental point of view. Like, I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of what some
It's
of those
everything,
common issues you
right?
see.
Like we talk about this so much, right? It's just the like the daily life. So like even like both of us who now work in sustainability, and we should talk about how we got here, but like both of us work in sustainability, and even when you are fully bought into the idea of like a net zero transition and a sustainable lifestyle, it's so hard to actually do that in practice, right? So it's like it's food, like where do you actually get that like healthy, organically grown pesticide, like food without like pesticides in it, right? Like it's flights,
Yeah.
transport, like how do we get around, like how do you go from A to B when there isn't good public transport? You're gonna have to get into your car, right? So like I think like all of these things, right? Like we need energy, we need transport, we need food, and we're wanting to make the right choices, but sometimes it's really hard to find good options.
Yeah. No, it really is. And because some of it as well, even if you mentioned before, like as, prices go up and things like that, those choices become really challenging for not just individuals, but for companies as well when everything costs more. Like low carbon isn't low cost. And that's always a challenge is that you might want to make, people need to make the best decisions that they can afford, whether that's around the food or the type of transport they have and some of that kind of stuff. And it is really challenging.
Yeah,
And we're not,
like I would kind of like come in with that like regulation lens, right? Because I do a lot of policy work, and like I think it's around incentives, right? So like as you say, like low carbon right now is not low cost. So that to me just means that the incentives aren't there, right? Like where's the subsidy? Where's the tax credit? Where's the like innovation fund that's actually going to fund us developing these solutions at scale? And like I just think like it's a matter of like where as a society we invest money to make sure that we have healthier outcomes, because like at the end of the day this is about us living healthier lives, right?
yeah, no, for sure. So should we talk a little bit about your background? We can talk a little bit about my background as well and how we kind of got here. And you and I met a number of years ago now at a conference in Europe. And around carbon markets and some of that kind of stuff. So just give everyone just, really high level kind of background for your background a little bit and how you got to where you are today.
How I get to where I am. So I started out working in conservation in a national park in sub-Saharan Africa. Straight out of high school. Like that's what I wanted to do, right? Like I wanted to keep trees standing because I really believed in this idea of like, um, being closer to nature, right? And like, how do we actually create better, healthier, more natural environments? And then I very quickly kind of realized that, like, when you're working in a national park and you're working in sub-Saharan Africa, you're sort of like on the receiving end of all these policy decisions, right? And like trade mechanisms, and like there's just a lot of things running against you where like you
Mm,
cannot actually create the development you need so that people don't rely on the forest for survival, right? So like everything that you see in terms of like logging, but also in terms of poaching, like that's
mm,
driven by poverty. And like if people had other options, they would live different lives, right? But like I very quickly kind of came to this like realization that you cannot save the trees by standing in the trees, right? Like I couldn't
mm.
protect the forest by working in the forest. So I did a 180 pivot. I went back to school. I studied environmental economics. I ended up working in policy. And then like most of my career, if you look at it, was spent inside of international organizations, right? So like I worked for the UN. I looked at the Sustainable Development Goals. Then I looked at sustainable financing. And then I spent a long time working for the World Economic Forum, where I kind of went from like industrial decarbonization more into like nature and financing for nature.
Mm.
And then, yeah, as you said, we both ended up working in carbon markets. We should talk about that. But like to me, like carbon markets really are the solution that makes the most sense, that will funnel finance to wherever it
Mm.
needs to go, right? Like whether that is nature, which needs conservation efforts, or whether that is industry, which needs decarbonization efforts. I think carbon markets are just like a really good mechanism to get money where it needs to go.
I love that. And I love that, like I've had my own pivots and stuff like that as well, right? And it's, like I think as we all think about our careers and where we're going and what we're passionate about, like that's really cool in terms of the pivot for you back into, I think everything boils down to economics. So I love that. And so like
Well,
I
economics, yes.
yeah, whether it's an individual, a company, a country, like people make decisions for economic reasons.
Yes. It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah, like so it's one of the reasons that I'm really excited that we're going to be diving into some of these things. And so as I kind of mentioned at the top, I'm a petroleum engineer by background, and I started my career in Australia, working for an operator out there. Um, running around on oil rigs, drilling wells and on production facilities. And to be honest, great fun, super fun. Um, like really great experience, really, really great technical work,
Was
really
it like
great
200
people.
men and you?
Yes,
Okay.
pretty much. So, and actually funny side story about that. So the very first time I went out to an oil rig, I was 23. And there had been a big deal about getting me out there because there'd been a whole thing around bed space because I was going to be the
Oh my
only female
God.
out there and we were drilling, so high operations and all this kind of stuff. So I'm sort of like wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, like landed on the rig from the helicopter. My computer got left on the beach. So they forgot to pack my computer onto the helicopter. And the company man came up to me and was like, "What are you even doing here?" I was like, I think I'm here for the operations. Like, what? I'm just old enough that like there was like only 2 phones that could actually call back to the beach and like call to the office and stuff because we were just far enough offshore that you didn't get good reception. Nobody was allowed cell phones. So
Oh
luckily
wow.
I'd memorized my manager's phone number so I could call him and we got through the operations. It was fine. But it took me 2 days to realize why everyone on the rig knew my name. Like, and I was talking to my mom and I was like, "Oh, that's why." Cause she was like, how many people on the rig? I'm like, 100. And she's like, "How many women?" I'm like, "Just me." And I was like, "Oh, that's why everyone knows my name."
Yeah,
She's like, "You
actually,
have to come."
women,
She's
like
like,
they
"You
were.
have to come home right now." Like, and to be fair, everyone was lovely. Like I've never it is a very lopsided but further through my career when I would go out, there would be more women and some of that kind of stuff. But I've never had any like issues with any of the men I've worked with and stuff like that, which I've been very fortunate around. Everyone's been amazing and very helpful and, happy to answer all of my hundreds of questions and all this kind of stuff. But,
Where was
it,
this?
pardon?
Where was this?
It was offshore Western Australia. So,
Australia. Okay.
yeah. So, really great fun. But then, so I worked for a couple of different operators. I left this West Australia and I moved to Queensland. And then I moved to the US in 2012 and joined a consulting firm and doing, again, economic evaluation. So thinking about how do we forecast oil and gas and what does that look like with, oil price and all this kind of stuff. And it was about 2018, I started becoming very vocal about the fact that the industry needed to do better. So if anyone here in the US remembers, 2018, gas prices were in the toilet. Gas was not really worth anything. And the US was flaring over a BCF of gas a day, just more than some countries consume. And I worked for a tiny little 8-person consulting firm. We were down to like 8 people at that point. And yet I was still labeled big bad oil. And sitting here in Colorado's got quite strict state laws here for operators. They were tough in 18. They're even tougher now. And everyone in Colorado was up in arms because they're like, "Well, but we're not flaring. Why is everyone mad at us?" And I was like, because we're all part of the same industry.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if I work for the tiniest company or the biggest company. We're all part of this same big bad oil. And unless the industry can do better, then we're not gonna make any progress. We can't flare a BCF of gas a day for economic reasons because gas wasn't worth anything, so couldn't afford to build the pipeline to get it to market. That's the wrong answer. And so I started becoming very vocal about that. And that was when I pivoted. I started making the pivot and I moved into emissions and carbon markets and really started to think about how do we price emissions into oil and gas pricing and some of that kind of stuff. And
Right,
which
like
is then
the
again,
realization of waste. Like you basically looked at
yeah,
it, you went, "This is so inefficient.
waste.
Why are we burning fuel when we all need fuel?" Because
Yep.
of a market, right? Like because the price is so low, like it's tanked to the point where it's just not worth transporting that gas anymore.
Yeah. And so it's like, how do we do better, right? And how do we, if the whole idea, the Department of Energy here in the US has just put out a report on climate, and Secretary Wright, Chris Wright, who's from Colorado as well. I've met Chris before and I've seen him speak a number of times, and he talks about energy poverty and human flourishing around, he doesn't deny climate change. But if the idea is energy poverty, why are we burning a BCF of gas a day? And to be fair, we're not burning that much anymore, but it's that kind of same thing. It's such a waste when people could use it. And so,
Right? So then like my question is always like, what's the incentive, right? So like if we have all this gas and people have all this need, why are we not getting the gas to the people?
yeah,
Right? So like what's the role of government or any other market mechanism to like actually get what we have to the people who need it?
yeah. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up here. So I'm still, and it still so often surprises people. I think I presented at an oil and gas conference about a year ago, and I knew the organizer very well. But was sort of presenting about how the oil and gas industry is changing. How do we think about emissions and methane and flaring and pricing and stuff, right? How do we incorporate carbon markets? What does that even mean? Because I know we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Like there's carbon markets is so many different things. And there's an education journey for a lot of people on that in terms of like, well, where do they even start? And the organizer had said to me, well, you're not going to be anti-oil and gas, are you? And I was
Mm.
like, no, that's not the point. It's, to be honest, it's not the point. Just because I'm talking about these things doesn't mean I'm against the industry. I think the industry can do better, but that doesn't mean I'm against it. And then after the event, and this has happened a number of times at different oil and gas events, but like after the event, I got this lovely little handwritten note by an old man from Texas that was like, I loved your presentation, but I don't believe in climate change. And to be fair, I didn't mention climate change. That's not like, I'm not, and I'm not here to lecture anyone on climate change. It's just the way that you are doing business is changing. And he sent me this lovely little handwritten note about how climate change wasn't real, and then sent me a whole bunch of stuff to prove it. And that happens to me a lot at some of these events. And so it's still a really, again, like how do we get these groups, very disparate groups, together around even having a conversation? And like I said, I'm really struggling to figure out like what do we even rally everyone around to get everyone to the table. So anyway, that's
Yeah,
a little bit of my background.
for sure. No, and I think it's so brave of you to be like out there and like be in the oil and gas industry and talk about like either the efficient use of energy or like the unnecessary waste that we're producing in some of these production facilities. Because I think it's like, I mean, we term them harder to be industries, right? Like I used to work on like steel and trucking and shipping and aviation, but it's like there are so many conversations to be had around these sectors where we really are still reliant on either the energy source or the material. And there's so many conversations to be had around like how do we get there? Like even if we do have the technology to get there, how do we actually roll that out?
Yeah.
And I guess like my story is probably the opposite of yours, right? Like I spend a lot of time at climate conferences, right? And like we always kind of like sit there in our own little, I don't want to call it a bubble, but we sit there in our community, right? And like in a way, while talking to people who are already convinced, right? And like I remember sitting in this like gathering, it must have been the groundswell or something, like sitting in this gathering like years ago, and we were like, you know what? Like the only reasonable thing for us to do is to like spend the next year to go to auto shows and go to oil and gas conferences and like for us to actually like go and engage in conversation rather than for us to go and talk to other people who work on climate policy, right? Because like we are already convinced that's not where we're going to make a mark. Like we're going to make a mark by doing what you do, like frankly, like going and speaking in energy conferences and talking about emissions management.
I think we're all so siloed though, right? Like you talk about like, and I've been to a number of climate events and carbon events now and stuff like that as well. And it is, you don't necessarily have people from any industries at those events, whether it's, like steel or automobile or, transport or whatever it is. They're climate events. And so all the climate people are there. And then you've got oil and gas conferences. And like even within oil and gas, like LNG is often separate. So you'll have a separate LNG conference, and then fuels is a separate industry. And so then they're not even at the same table. And so the issues we have around like even trying to understand the supply chains to calculate emissions and get good baselines so that we even know then how many carbon credits we need to reduce and to, to offset all the emissions. Like even some of those industries don't know how to talk to each other, even though they're all lumped the same way.
Oh,
So
for sure. Because like our data management systems aren't integrated, right? Like it's so hard to actually go into a carbon footprint or like understand where your energy supply came from or understand like, what's happening in your materials upstream and downstream and how they're being used. Like it's damn near impossible. But like that's why, right? Like it's these like different bubbles, it's a non-overlapping like Venn diagram where we're all having conversations in different places. And like I think, if we can break that up a little bit, I think then we will have done a lot.
yeah, it's where some of the policy stuff, I think some of the policy stuff is really interesting right now because it is sort of done in some of these echo chambers. At least I think it is. So I'd love kind of your take on that. But like it's, stuff like the corporate disclosures that require scope 3 emissions requires companies to go out and understand the emissions of their supply chain. And yet we're not set up to do that. And so again, the environmental policy folks are saying, oh no, it's fine. This is what we're going to do. We're going to regulate it. We're just going to make them do it. And industry's out there being like, what? Like, we don't know who to call to go and get that information and talk to.
They're not even saying what. They've understood what. They're like, how? Which are you going to do this?
It's true. Like,
no, I mean, like, I completely agree. Like, it's, so I think, I don't know, like, we always talk about different levers, right? As in, like, you can create, like, if you want to create change, you need to have a lever that will actually bring about change in the real economy. And in the real economy, that's where the emissions happen. So, like, the levers are investment pressure, right? So, like, you either get the investors on board to create pressure, policy pressure, so you can write these policies and then companies are very innovative, right? Like, they will figure it out if they're regulated to figure it out. It's just that regulatory processes take a long time and they're very expensive and they're often hard to implement. And then you can have consumer pressure, right? Like, that's the other way to do it. Like, if there's enough consumer pressure out there, like either consumer preference, as in, like, can you clearly see consumers move into like more sustainable choices or more healthy choices? Or you can create consumer pressure, as in, like, you know, can there be more so like consumer activism about, you know, I don't want to say finger pointing, but yes, finger pointing, blacklisting, right? As in, like, do we really want to talk about the companies that we think aren't doing enough? So I think that those are the three levers. And, like, in a way, sometimes I actually think it's healthy when we all sit there and scratch our heads and go, like, how? Right? Like, I was like responding to, like, you know, even as a carbon person, like, I was responding to a consultation today where I was reading through like 50 pages of extremely technical text. And by the end of it, I went like, it's not that I necessarily disagree with the notion, right? So, like, the notion was to like put responsibility on carbon project developers to ensure that there's no reversals of the emission reduction in the future. It wasn't even that I disagreed with the notion, but I literally was sitting there and I was like, but how? Like, we don't actually have a well-functioning insurance mechanism right now that we could employ to do that, right? Like, I think that sometimes that like pressure of like having a guideline that you can't quite achieve yet is actually what triggers the process that will bring about the change, that will bring about the collaboration along the value chain, right? As in, like, me right now in my situation, I'm going like, oh, I need to go and talk to some insurers. I think the same thing can happen in scope 3, right? As in, like, I think having that pressure of like wanting to comply with the GHG protocol, for example, like, that is what is going to make you go and engage your value chain. It's just, that's a process. That's not something that'll happen tomorrow.
Yep. And it's, you know, I think that's something as well, like, by having open conversations about it and understanding that that process is going to take time, if we can bring the right people to the table for those conversations, at least it will continue to move. If we don't, though, then things will stall. And I know we were talking about some of the SBTI stuff that's happened, where the SBTI talked about doing an oil and gas pathway, potentially a little bit reluctantly, but that's now stopped because, you know, the people they did bring to the table, the companies, the oil and gas companies that they brought to the table, have stepped back and said, no, it wasn't a compromise anymore, and they left. And so now we have no progress. Never mind incremental, like, so it's just nothing, like, instead of any incremental progress on anything, and that becomes, again, we go back into our little boxes, and back into our little silos where we don't talk to each other. So super challenging.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's like a fundamental disagreement there. Like, I think that, like, that's the Science-Based Targets Initiative, right? Like, there has always been a really foundational disagreement over whether there should be an oil and gas pathway, right? So, like, on the one hand, you have experts saying that oil and gas cannot be part of a net zero future, and then on the other hand, you have probably more on the practitioner side, you have people saying that, you know, but you still need to talk about how to transition those companies, right? As in, like, how do we move from like a high carbon content to a low carbon content energy supply? Because we still need to engage with the industry to go from A to B. So I think that there's just always been this like really foundational disagreement over like whether the SBTI, which is a Science-Based Target Initiative, should be providing a transition pathway for the oil and gas industry, or if they should just come out with like a very public sort of announcement saying that oil and gas doesn't have a place in a net zero future.
No. Which they kind of did. I would actually argue that they kind of did with their financial net zero targets, where they've been very clear that financial institutions to get to net zero cannot fund fossil fuels. So I would say they've kind of started to put that line in the sand a little bit. No? Is that?
Oh, I got you onto that last week, didn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's the line in the sand, right? As in, like, I think it actually says you cannot fund, as in, like, within, like, if you want to get to a net zero, a net zero portfolio as a financial institution, you couldn't be funding fossil fuel companies without a transition plan, right? As in, like, there are companies, like I was reading about what Vattenfall today. There obviously are companies that, like, traditionally had a fossil fuel portfolio and are transitioning towards a renewables portfolio. And like, I think that that's a little bit the spirit, right? As in, like, of course you can be funding an energy company if that energy company is in transition themselves. I think that's an important distinction, right? So, like, the idea is a little bit like, if there is no effort to lower the carbon intensity of fuel production, or electricity production in this case, then that shouldn't get funding. But yeah, like, as you say, like, is it a line in the sand, right? And, like, yeah, do we agree with that? I think is the question.
And I mean, the other piece of it, so looking through that, some of the dates that they were calling for is 2030 for like no more in terms of development and stuff like that. And so development of oil and gas activities and fossil fuel activities. And that's really soon. I think, a lot of people have
It's
been,
really soon. It's really soon. Yeah,
so,
yeah.
so it's going to
I
be,
mean, it's a good marker, right? Like, we say net zero by 2050, like, requires us to have emissions by 2030, and, like, we're just not on track for that, right? And I feel like there's maybe, as time progresses, I mean, we're 5 years, not even 5 years away from 2030, right? And, like, I think
yeah,
there's a real question on, like, how do we accelerate progress in the market towards lowering emissions?
yeah. So I'm
Carbon
conscious of
markets,
time.
Deb. We need to talk about carbon markets.
We do. Let's talk about carbon markets quickly. So, um, where do you want to start? Because I know there's a lot of misconceptions in the carbon markets that I know we talked about in terms of like, is that the best place to start for folks in terms of like some of the biggest myths in the carbon markets
Well, start
potentially?
off with, like, why do you think it's a good idea?
So you said this at the top, and I think that holistically the carbon markets provide and I teach a master's class around this, and I always tell my students, I'm like, at the end of the day, it's a market. The idea of a carbon market is someone who's putting money into a project, developing that project, and being paid for it based on the price of carbon, very much like a commodity. And so it does, as you said, it does provide funding for activities that potentially wouldn't be funded otherwise, which is, I know we can get into the nuance of the fact that that has to happen. That's additionality. But so I think it's actually really positive. In that regard, the piece I really struggle with is then there's so many different there's so many different types of environmental instruments. Carbon credits within the carbon markets are one of those instruments. And that's where I see, particularly for industry, I think that's a challenge. We talk about lots of different things beyond just carbon markets. And so I think it's challenging for companies to know where to put their money, where do they invest, is there going to be return on that investment, or is it just capital spent and stuff? So there's a lot to be figured out, but I think high level, again, it's the mechanism of it is great, is the starting point. But that's so yeah. What's sort of your
Yeah, same. I mean, like, I always came from it as a, like, I've said this before, right? Like, what are the incentives? Like, why would anybody want to change the way that they produce cement, or why would anybody want to change the way that they produce steel? Um, because, like, I think that at the personal level, like, we can just come to a conclusion that we want to, like, move more in this direction, but, like, at the economic level, like, for, like, an economy-wide transition, there needs to be an incentive and needs to make financial sense. So yeah, to me, carbon markets, like, carbon instruments, have always just made the most sense, as in, like, we're actually we're reducing emissions where it is the most cost effective, right? So, like, whether you're looking at a cap and trade scheme like what you're seeing in the EU, or whether you're looking at the voluntary carbon market, like, the idea behind that is always the same, right? Like, you're basically saying, like, we're going to take $1 or $100 of investment that we have available, and we're going to invest it where it buys us the most emission reductions, so it has the greatest climate impact, right? So like if you're buying an allowance off a different company, it means that, you know, the company that has a higher cost of mitigation is putting a price on carbon because they're buying that allowance, and they're giving that money to a company that has an easier transition pathway into like a low carbon technology, right? Like it just makes sense. Isn't like that $100 or $100 million is just going to buy us more emission reductions. So like it's just the most efficient instrument for us to achieve emission reductions quicker. Which is really why I'm in carbon markets. And then we can talk about the, as you say, like there's a gazillion instruments within that, right? As in like compliance, voluntary, international markets, like so many things happening.
Yeah. And I think it's, you know, the other piece that we've talked a lot offline around like the different types of credits. You know, I think, what does that even mean? You know, should we prioritize certain types of credits, whether it's what's called a nature-based credit or a tech-based credit, or should we prioritize lowest cost, or like how to, in terms of your view on this, like should it just be lowest cost, whether it's an avoidance or a removal credit or whatever? Like where do you sit in that kind of like priority space, if that makes sense? Like where should we be putting the capital?
Where we get real emission reductions and removals, right? So like I think that at the moment, like it depends a little bit. Like things are changing the voluntary market, but like traditionally, like the price of a ton of carbon hasn't necessarily been reflective of like whether that's a good ton or not, right? Like now that we're seeing ratings agencies come in, we're seeing a stronger price correlation with like the quality of a credit, right? Like I think like the first criterion to me is always like you should be putting your money into a project that has a proven track record of like removing or reducing carbon, right? Isn't like that's the most important thing. And like I personally don't think that there is like I don't think we should have such a strong divide between like the technology credits, right, as in like industry and energy credits, and the nature credits. I think we need everything, right? And like that's what the IPCC is telling us over and over, is that we need to invest both in like technological transitions but also in land use transitions, right? Like we also need regenerative agriculture, and we also need natural carbon sinks in the form of forests, wetlands, oceans, and so on, right? So like it's not that it's one or the other, and it's not that one credit is better than the other. So what you need to look at is the individual project, right? Like are they generating a real emission reduction?
Yep. And where do you sit on, there's always a big debate in the industry, in the carbon markets around removals versus avoidance. Where do you sit in terms of like, again, like if it's like we need everything and we just need to prioritize the biggest impact, do you think removals versus avoidance matters? Or yeah, where do you sit on that one?
So I do think that it matters, but I think it matters in timescales, right?
Mm.
As in, like, we know that overall we need to decrease emissions to get to net zero. We know that we have a certain amount of emissions at the very end that we cannot get rid of, right? Like they're just like inherent in the manufacturing processes that we use. So like whatever emissions that are impossible to abate, right, residual emissions, we're gonna need removals, right? So like we're gonna need like the same amount. If you still have emissions here, you're gonna need the same amount of removals to balance that out. So like yes, we absolutely need removals, and we absolutely need to invest in removals today to make them become more cost effective, right? So like
Yeah.
that's very true. It shouldn't mean, I think that there's a lot of confusion around this point, like it shouldn't mean that we're not investing in reductions anymore, right? So like when I say we need to get to net zero, like what I'm pointing out here is that we need to reduce emissions, right? So like the first thing we need to do is reduce, and the second thing we need to do is remove, right? And like if we stop investing in reductions right now, it actually means that we never get to a net zero scenario. So
Yeah.
like right now in this day and age, and especially in the first half of the century, right, like we need to invest into natural carbon sinks, and we need to invest into like getting to zero, as in like reductions. So
Yeah.
as time progresses, we're going to need more and more removals and less reductions, but that only makes sense if we've invested in all those reductions already.
Yeah, because you're right. Because some of the technology to actually remove CO2 is horrendously expensive right now, and we need,
Yes.
like whether it's direct air capture or like, all these other, mineralization and BECCS and everything else that's sort of in that kind of like technology removal. The piece from the nuance for me on this one, and it was with a conversation with Jenny Morgan from Tradewater around avoidance credits, is industrial pollutants, because I think we talk about carbon and we automatically all just go to CO2, but we're talking about all greenhouse gases, and CO2 is the only one we can actually remove right now, at least. So for methane and nitrous oxide and some of the other things, we have to avoid them so that they don't actually go into the atmosphere. And particularly looking at methane, that one actually can be quite cost effective in terms of some of the removals on that. And so that's where, like, it'll be interesting to see. I've been talking to and working with a number of companies here in the US that are looking at orphan wells. So for those not familiar, there's like millions of old abandoned oil and gas wells all over the US. And people are starting to think about and are starting to use the carbon markets to get funding to essentially plug and abandon those wells and stop methane and other things leaking out into the atmosphere, but mostly methane. But there's been a little bit of there's confusion there around and stuff like that. So it's like, in theory, it's a great, in theory, it's this great idea. It solves this huge problem we have. It avoids all of this methane going up into the atmosphere. And yet there's still challenges because of very specific, nuanced things around methodologies and different types of credits and all this kind of stuff. And so it's, I feel like it's always one step forward, two steps back a little bit with some of this stuff. But the industrial pollutants in particular, I think from an avoidance point of view, and again, it's something I see industry really focused on, because for them, it's quite a cost-effective way of reducing their own footprints just within their operations. So it's an interesting kind of piece of this. And should that then be, there's a big question around well, then should that actually be carbon credits, or should it just be part of doing business? And there's a whole kind of conversation there as well. So I'm curious as to your thoughts around that piece as well.
What are my thoughts on oil well plugging? I would say that surprisingly, and I think we often find that we surprisingly agree on many things. I would say that 100% we need to do it, and we right now need to use carbon finance to do it. So, I think there's this logic, right? That if we start producing carbon credits within an oil and gas value chain, that we're basically extending the lifetime of an oil and gas operation, right? Because we're basically paying for the cleanup. And I think that there is a logic that this should be part of the responsibility of the company, should be in general to plug these wells. You could regulate that, and I think there's a good argument to be made there. The truth is that right now we don't have that, right? So as you're saying, there's all these wells out there and they are leaking methane, and we can, it's very easy to actually just go and plug them. So if we can if we can create an incentive to do the right thing now, I think we should do it. I also think that regulators should catch up with us, right, and just regulate it. But in the absence of regulation, I always think that the voluntary carbon market should be stepping in.
Yeah. And I think the nuance on this, there's lots of different stages of an oil well or a gas well's life, and the orphan wells specifically are called orphan wells because they don't actually have an owner anymore. And that's the biggest challenge for those ones, is that any regulation for companies with their existing wells that they have, as wells are getting to the end of their life and stuff, if they're still part of that company's portfolio, then regulation, and there is in different states, there's the regulation around what that means. But for the orphan well problem, where some of these wells were hundreds of years old, the companies don't exist anymore, they went out of business, they're bankrupt, whatever it was, people have walked away from these wells, and they're orphaned. They don't have a home. And so and so that's where I think in particular there is a huge amount of need for finance to come in to solve this really big problem. So anyway, so really interesting. But yeah, like I said, there's challenges then around, once those credits are generated, who's buying them, and is there a demand? And we haven't even spoken about sort of some of that kind of side of it, of once we have all these credits, it's a voluntary market, right? For a lot of this stuff, people companies are voluntarily buying these credits mostly because of their shareholder and stakeholder pressure and stuff, and wanting to, try and start to move the needle a little bit against their net zero plans. But we're a long way away from the supply demand equation being right in this market. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, we definitely are a long way away from that. I feel like we're running out of time, and there's so
I
much
was
more
going
to
to
talk
say, this is a
about.
great intro.
It's a great intro. There'll be many more episodes coming up.
Yeah.
Deb, what's top of mind for the next one?
Yeah. So some of the stuff that I've been really looking at, given where I sit here in the US, is some of the stuff that's going on with the EPA, looking at reversing what's called the endangerment finding. So that's something that we can definitely dive into. I recently put a post out on Substack about the DOE's new climate report that they've put out that people can go check out, and we can link in the show notes as well. About sort of the comparison to the IPCC climate report from 2023. So some of the policy things that are going on in Washington are definitely top of mind for me. So how about you?
Yeah, same. News, 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 right? Like, there's so much happening in the carbon market. I think it's really interesting, or in wider climate markets, right? Like, it's so interesting to just, like, talk a little bit about how we see that affecting what's next, right? So, like, some of the things I've been looking at is Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, right? There's an ongoing consultation on 6.4 and what kind of methodologies are going to be eligible. I was really involved in the EU claims directive drama for a while, right? As in, like, what are we actually going to regulate on claims? What companies can claim and cannot claim? And that drives demand, right? Like, as you were saying earlier. Yeah, and then there's a bunch of like new standards popping up, right? Like, we're hearing all kinds of news about, like, like which carbon crediting standards are like developing new methodologies, what's coming up in that space, who's up and who's down. So I think there's lots to talk about in the
There is
next.
there is lots for us to cover, and if there's any topics that you guys would like us to cover, put a comment in the chat and stuff, and let us know what topics you'd like us to tackle as well. But Teresa, great first show,
For
really
sure.
fun, and looking forward to the next one.
More to do next time.
Cool. Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Take care.